we go with the Nick Cave album with Warren Ellis. We are being spoiled with a surprise release from the man, Nick Cave. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds obviously only dropped Ghosteen a couple of years back. You know, if you're a fan of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, you would already know that. But if you aren't keeping up with what they're doing, then please go check out Ghosteen, because I actually think it's one of the biggest highlights in the career of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, which isn't a popular opinion. I don't think people seem to think it's up there with the best. I'm not saying it is the best album ever in the discography, but I think it's like top 3, maybe top 5, around that area. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. I think the lyrics across the album were devastating. I think the themes were incredibly interesting and really detailed and vivid, and always interesting to pick apart. Even after multiple listens, there was always little lines that I'd go back to and go, shit, that references this, and oh man, this references that. It's a really rewarding listen in that sense. And I think when you let the music consume you, you really do begin to feel how beautiful the instrumentals are, as bare as they are too. It's certainly not one of the most urgent albums in their discography. And I think this new album here, Carnage, continues that path of beautiful new age ballad type tracks. It certainly keeps things very straight to the point, with Nick Cave often singing in a very heartbreaking tone over some really delicate, soft piano, and maybe some other instruments coming through occasionally as well. And I think what happens with this album here is that once you dig into the lyrics further and read into the really extreme detail that Nick goes into with his writing, you really start to appreciate the song so much more. Like, everything comes together in such a beautiful way. But do be wary, because it's not an easy listen. It's really not. Like, there are some incredibly difficult moments to stomach. And I think, you know, it's really not for the faint-hearted. And I think Nick Cave's always been like that anyway. Hand of God is an interesting track, because I always love it when Nick uses like religious imagery to put a point across, or make his music just stand out in a way that not many writers would be able to achieve. And I tend to find religion really interesting anyway. As much as I'm not particularly religious myself, I think when Nick writes about religion, he does it in such a fantastic way. And it's not even overly complex either. It's very straight to the point. It's very simple. He's essentially putting his fate into God's hands. He wants the river to sweep him away, and essentially, you know, get the hand of God to determine his life and his fate, you know, whether it means death. He references the kingdom, so of course he's clearly looking to the heavens and thinking that, is it God's time to take his life into his or her or whatever being God is? And, you know, look at Nick Cave and think, I'm deciding what's next for you. And you get a huge amount of references to the kingdom on this album, to the point where it gets a bit worrying. Like, I know Ghosteen was incredibly heartbreaking to listen to, but there's something about the constant references to heaven on this album that kind of makes me think about Nick and wonder if everything's truly okay, because I'm not convinced. White Elephant has got to be the most violent song I think he's ever put out in years. And while, you know, he isn't doing it from his own perspective here, it's that final leg of the track where he puts so much emphasis on the kingdom once again that makes it really depressing. And the first section essentially only really reinforces his obsession with death. It's always been there with Nick Cave. His earliest stuff with the Bad Seeds, there's been so many songs that are linked to death and murder, and here we go once again where he's focusing on the White Hunter. It's a reference to last summer with all the protests, George Floyd, you know, everything that happened in regards to that. And he, you know, makes references to even a statue being forced onto the ground, and, you know, someone kneeling on its neck and not being able to breathe. And then, you know, they're like, well, now you know how it feels. Really interesting way to reference something very specifically. And I think this is probably going to be the hardest hitting song I think he's wrote in quite a while, in the sense that it's so on the nose. Like, there are parts where he says, I'm going to shoot you in the face and things like that. It's just so blood curdling with the way he presents it. And it kind of stands out like a bit of a sore thumb in the album, to be honest, because many of the other tracks are much more softer and much more reflective, whereas this track is just so like gruesome and just wants to smash you in the face. He does have an urgency with his delivery on Old Time though. It's not like every track is a soft, slow ballad. I think his delivery here is fantastic and actually one of the best tracks in terms of how his vocals are, you know, bringing such a he's very reminiscent about old times, clearly specifically about someone else, about things that they did, but then at the end of the track he just reminds them that yes, this is like old times, but I won't be coming back this time, which again links to this really depressing idea of, you know, death. Is Nick Cave essentially saying to people that, you know, it's his long road to heaven at this point, there is no return, which is literally what he says on Lavender Fields, where he's beautifully describing this really like sunny, flowery, naturous field that he's walking down, but he's essentially saying to the, you know, the people, or, you know, the audience, that he's on this road alone. He doesn't know really where it's going to take him, and once again he references the kingdom is essentially a long road to heaven. I don't know. What is Nick telling us here? Shattered Ground is essentially him talking about how all of his pieces, everything about his being is just falling apart and being scattered over the shattered ground. Could be a sort of unique way of talking about ashes and, you know, sprinkling the ashes on the ground, which is something that you see at funerals. It's once again just really detailed and descriptive writing that makes the most simple thing sound beautifully written. And I say this often with Nick Cave, but I think if you gave a similar song to a completely different writer, they wouldn't be able to approach it in a way that he does. I mean, even on Carnage with the opening line, which is very simple, but the idea of him saying, I always seem to say goodbye, is just a really heartbreaking lyric that I think he manages to sell with his really, really pained delivery. I think that's one thing that's really helped Nick Cave's aging process, because he's getting on at this point in his career, but it manages to just bring in this really unique emotion in the way that he sings because of his voice that's always cracking and just sounds really croaky. He's still a great singer, by the way, but I just think there's a strange aesthetic with what comes with his voice. Balcony Man is really beautifully put together. This morning is amazing and so are you is just such a beautiful line. Honestly, I think anyone on the receiving end of that would be absolutely delighted to hear such a thing. Essentially just being stood at the balcony watching, maybe waiting for something, as he keeps alluding to with a lot of his lyrics. And he closes out the album with the most realistic line I think I've heard in quite some time. And you know, it's pessimistic in perhaps a way that some people might not like, but I think it does hold truth to it. And he says, what doesn't kill you makes you crazier. He's kind of twisting the idea of, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which I've always thought was a bit of a wishy-washy thing to say, but of course Nick Cave, being the man he is, just comes out and says, what doesn't kill you makes you crazier. Which again, I'm just hoping everything is okay in terms of his mental health, because there's so much of his music in recent years that's just had such a depressing outlook to it since the death of his son. And yeah, I mean, every album that I sit through from Nick is a lot. It's a lot. So yeah, once again, a lot to unpack with Carnage. I mean, I think it's a really good album. I do think some moments just don't enamor me as much as I'd like them to, because I think a lot of what he did here was already done on Ghosteen, and of course what he's doing with Warren Ellis on this album. Obviously it's a joint effort, but yeah, I think the moments on Ghosteen just impacted me ever so slightly more, which kind of sours tracks like Albuquerque, for example, which I don't really find all that impressive in comparison to what I've heard him do in the past. But still very, very good, and a 7.5 out of 10 from me. Could easily grow. Maybe in a few months I'll be saying, actually, I was wrong about that, and this is closer to more like an 8 out of 10. But I think a 7.5 is really good for now. Definitely worthy of your time. And I'd of course love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think of this album, if you love it, if you don't like it that much. Whatever you think would be great to see. Where it ranks in Nick Cave's general discography, would love to see what you think of that. Thank you for watching. Do have a good day. Subscribe if you haven't already. And goodbye.